Friends, thank you very much for joining us again for our discussion, our conversation between myself, Ian, and James, where we are aiming to bring the word to life. James, nice to see you again.
Nice to see you in. Yeah.
And did you enjoy the conversation last week?
I did actually. I found it really stimulating, and it was really good. It really helped my preaching actually, just to have chatted with you about it. In the week before, so really helpful for
It
me.
does.
Yeah.
It does. And I found it really interesting as well, because not only had you done the work on the stone jars and all that stuff, but there was a number of points where you took us off in a new direction, which I hadn't thought of, which I thought was really helpful as well.
Okay. Yeah. Well, it was good. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, good. Now, this week we're changing. We're back. I asked you about how you felt about the fourth gospel, the gospel according to John, as it's popularly known. But of course, we're switching back this week to our gospel lectionary reading is from Luke chapter 4. And as I did comment, a slightly odd selection from the lectionary in terms of the passage. It's a bit truncated at the beginning and a bit truncated at the end. But I ought to ask you how you view the gospel of Luke. I know you said that John was certainly in your top four, so I expect Luke's in your top four as well.
Yes, I think Luke was my top gospel, my first top gospel, as it were, and of course, therefore, it's still in the top four. And be reassured to know. What I love about Luke is that you've got this second volume in Acts, so you've got this massive sweep of history, really, in terms of Christian history, early Christian history, and all the fascinating connections about how the gospel is played out in Acts are wonderful. And all the emphases in Luke are wonderful too. I love the way in which he puts men and women together, tells stories about how the gospel impacts them all the time, all the way through the gospel. All sorts of things like that. Emphasis on the Spirit. It's all wonderful stuff.
Yeah, and we get quite a lot of that here. I won't hold it against you. You just use the word impact as a verb, which of course is
I am so sorry. I apologise. I shall wash my mouth out.
I think you might need to be released from that. Or
thank you. Well,
we'll come to.
Let's hope Luke 4 releases me.
Yeah, but of course, as I've gone through, this is when I first started writing these weekly lectionary comments, was 3 years ago. So this is the second time through Luke for me. And one of the things I value is Luke's sort of precision and his really careful way that he structures things. And of course, you mentioned men and women. And one of the things that's very striking in this gospel is the way that Luke constantly is pairing men and women. So you get Zechariah, you get Mary with the Magnificat and the Benedictus, you get the stories of the lost with the woman searching for the coin and the shepherd searching for the sheep and so on. So it's going to be very interesting. Yeah, great.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good. I'm glad it's still in your top four.
Yeah.
Well, shall we have a look at this passage? And I guess, first of all, as I did last week, I simply asked you, was there anything particular that struck you out of this passage that we might begin to pick up on, or about the commentary that I wrote, which again, I've republished yesterday. So is there anything particular you want to start with, or should we just go to the passage from the beginning?
Well, I think the thing that does strike me particularly is the way in which this passage can easily be misunderstood. And it's sometimes people just preach on it as though it's almost a kind of social program, rather than anything to do with spirituality or belief in Jesus or whatever. And I think it's very, very much a both and passage. And I think that's something that's really important to emphasize. We can get sort of diverted if we don't hold together the importance of belief in the God of Israel, incarnated in Jesus Christ, alongside the call to justice and compassion. So I think that's something that's really important here. And I think that's there's some other stuff as well, which I think the lectionary misses because it doesn't let us read the Elijah and Elisha bit, which I know you do in your blog, but that's really frustrating because I think those stories are there, but placed there very carefully in Jesus' teaching and therefore by Luke to explain what Jesus has been saying in the quotation from Isaiah.
There's two really interesting things out of that. I mean, you mentioned just at the very beginning the connection between Luke's gospel, as it were, Luke part 1 and Luke part 2 in Acts. And again, I was struck again rereading the reflection and rereading the passage at how this comes out, so that Luke appears to put this episode in the place he does near the beginning of Jesus' ministry, whereas the other two Gospels, Matthew and Mark, who actually include this, they put it much later on. And Luke appears to do that because it's got some key programmatic elements in it. And we actually see Jesus' ministry unfolding following the example of releasing people and of, setting captives free and so on, and actually using that language very specifically about healings later on. And of course, you then see the same thing happening in Acts, where you see that the apostles are precisely continuing this ministry of Jesus that he's introduced in this way.
Yes.
The other thing that's interesting about the Elijah and Elisha thing, one of the things, again, I noted, and I've got to hand my trusty Throckmorton. I don't think we mentioned Throckmorton last week, because this is a synopsis of the first three Gospels. And again, one of the sort of disciplines for me in reading any of the synoptic Gospels is always to compare the parallel passages, not particularly to try and find a harmony or to do anything funny, other than simply to say, what is this particular Gospel saying? Because you find the distinctive sections of it.
Yeah.
And as you rightly highlight, that bit that's been chopped out by the lectionary, the example of Elijah and Elisha, is actually distinctive to Luke, that Matthew and Mark don't include that.
Yeah.
Shall we start at the beginning of the passage? Start at the very beginning. It's a very good place to start. I don't know how you felt about this introduction. It's not really the introduction to this passage in the lectionary. Is actually the tail end of the passage before.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. It's odd, isn't it? They kind of added verses in at the beginning and left verses out at the end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I was always told by my, at the time, Lord Bishop of Salisbury, who'd been involved in the common worship, he was chair of the commission. He said that when I quizzed him about this sort of thing, he always said, well, the lectionary is advisory. So
excellent. Well, that's what we want to hear, isn't it?
It is really. So if you think the lecture's done something stupid, then you can put it right. And
yes, absolutely. and indeed frequently do.
I think that's going to come up as a theme here. I was very struck. I can't remember if you and I have talked about this before, but I've long been struck by these concluding, or the sort of bridging verses between the testing in the desert and this passage. And of course, we'll come to that in Lent in a few weeks' time. Jesus returned in the power of the Spirit to Galilee. Now, you mentioned again that Luke is distinctive in its focus on the Spirit. And what I love about this is that he has his baptism and the Spirit comes on him in the form of a dove, and he goes into the desert in the Spirit.
Yes.
And it's having been tested that he comes out in the power of the Spirit. And Luke seems to be making a very particular point here. Luke's also got an interest in power. The language of power is much more frequent in this gospel than Matthew and Mark.
Yeah.
And I was really struck by this phrase, a report about him went through all the surrounding country, and he taught in their synagogues, being glorified by all. I mean, that's extraordinary language. He's been glorified by all. And I don't know, what does it have to be about somebody that being filled with the power of the Spirit, that in itself makes an impact?
Yeah.
This extraordinary report goes about all, Luke is emphatic, it goes out through all the surrounding country.
Yes.
And I thought it was interesting that whereas the other Gospels often link the power of the Spirit with signs and wonders, with deliverance and healings and so on, I think it's very interesting that Luke here links the power of the Spirit with Jesus's teaching.
Yes.
So,
yes. Yeah, absolutely. And it's fascinating in the actual in the incident in Nazareth itself that this there's this. Well, I mean, it's very interesting. I think Kenneth Bailey in his commentary suggests that verse 22, all spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his mouth, could also be translated. That actually they were witnessing against him, that actually this is not an affirmation but a counter to that, and of course the result of the people's reaction to Jesus is the Spirit. Some people are amazed and praise him, and some people react against him. And so, but this is the result of the power of the Spirit in Jesus, that people, they are divided by it.
Yes, that's not a very popular message, really, is it? Be filled with the Spirit and cause division amongst people. That's not, And I think it again, it's interesting, and perhaps again, doubly unfortunate that the lectionary cuts off the end, because there is such a strong contrast with the fact that at the beginning all glorified him, doxazo, and at the end they are filled with thumos. They're filled with fury.
Yeah,
like what he said, because in the power of the Spirit, he said something which is deeply offensive to them. So
yes.
Yeah,
I mean, there's a very interesting comment, I think, once again by Bailey, who suggests that Nazareth is a settler town in Galilee of the Gentiles. So it's a conservative Jewish town where people are, as indeed they do in modern day situations, settling in a culture,
Slightly hostile environment.
hostile environment.
Yeah.
And the verses that follow in Isaiah that Jesus does not quote are ones that would have been heard by the settlers in a very positive way, in the sense that they saw Gentiles serving them and all those sorts of things. Because that's what Isaiah 61 goes on to say.
Yes, it does.
But Jesus omits that because he says actually, and then gives us two examples of Gentiles acting in faith through Elisha and Elijah's ministry. And that's why they were so cross with him, because he wasn't coming and reading out the bit of Isaiah they wanted him to read. They wanted him to read their favourite passage and interpret it the way they interpreted it. And actually, that's not what he did at all. He reinterprets it and then tells two stories which really rather, confront them with some attitudes, problematic attitudes, where they think faith is only found in Israel and all those sorts of things.
Well, there's a kind of inversion going on. I mean, that's been a theme, hasn't it? Because of course we see in the Benedictus, we see particularly in the Magnificat, we see this idea of inversion of expectations, and again that observation, it reinforces that there's an inversion.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, definitely.
I was quite struck by, and I haven't done much reflection on it. When we get into sort of the heart of the passage here in verse 16, he came to Nazareth, where he'd been brought up. I don't know if that comment about where he'd been brought up is just setting the scene for when he goes on to say, no prophet is acceptable in his hometown, and they take offense of him. But it just seems to be quite significant. Because he's clearly left there and he's gone to settle in Capernaum. That's become his hometown, and so this is a return to the place where he grew up. I suppose it's just one of those things, isn't it? That great. I mean, it's a general truth. Great people go away from their home place, they come back, and of course the people there say, well, we knew you when you were a nipper, you weren't so great then. But I don't know if there's any more.
But I think there's also something perhaps going on there, that if the sort of settler town idea and is conservative, and Jesus has gone away and actually rather become slightly rather different and changed, from what they thought they had brought him up to be, then the challenge that he brings back to Nazareth is emphasized by the fact that he was brought up there, but that is not. He's not replicating what Nazareth wanted to replicate. So I think that's a really interesting dimension, that he's come back with this challenging message.
And I guess it's a reminder that any of us who engage in the business of the kingdom of God, then the work of the kingdom isn't there to serve us. It's the other way around. We're there to serve God's purposes in the kingdom. So
yeah, absolutely.
Now, I've got to confess that I absolutely love the detail. I mean, I mentioned before, I think I like the precision in Luke. Now, there's a couple of things here I was really fascinated by. So first of all, he came to Nazareth, as was his custom. He went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day. Now, that's interesting in itself, because of course Luke is focusing for us. Here is Jesus, the Torah observant Jew.
Yes.
And again, I really want to push back when people say, oh, Jesus only came to the non-religious and the outcasts and stuff. Well, not according to Luke. All the way through Luke, God speaks to, and Jesus comes to the religious as well. And, all the way the first few chapters.
Been emphasized over and over again, hasn't it? Yeah.
It has. That the pious observant, those in the temple who are worshipping, those who are expecting, looking for the consolation of Israel. So God honors faithfulness.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But the next bit I really love is that when he stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him, because that's exactly what would happen. And then at the end, and the other thing I love, he unrolled the scroll. So actually Luke uses a particular technical term for actually unrolling the scroll that is written on. So there's some nice precision there. And of course, he found the place where it's written, because in a scroll, you can't just open and turn to the page or find the right chapter. You have to scroll through, you have to find the bit. And then at the end, he rolls up the scroll and gave it back to the attendant and sat down. There's a couple of things I love there. First of all, that in a synagogue, you would have an attendant or a minister who's the one who's responsible for looking after the
scroll management. Yes,
scroll management. That's right. Yeah, and pass it out. So which the other two gospels don't have. You get this lovely little detail. And the other thing I found really fascinating is this word attendant, huperete, actually comes in Luke 1. I don't know if you've noticed this, where when Luke is writing to dear Theophilus, he talks about those who have been eyewitnesses and attendants of the word from the very beginning. Now, most Bible translations translate that servants of the word. So everyone thinks that's like a diakonos word, but it's actually this word here. So it's actually got, one of its meanings is those who attend to the scrolls. And I read a little while ago, someone who was suggesting that perhaps this is an indication that from the early days, people have been writing things down about Jesus, and actually Luke is depending on eyewitnesses and those who made notes at the time, as it were. There's been a store of writing that he's consulting. So I just thought that was a really nice little bit of detail.
And I think, and then that second half of that verse, the eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him, is an amazing thing, really. I mean, there's this a sense of high drama, really. I mean, this is this passage for me has always conjured up an image, a mental image of Jesus in the synagogue. I don't think you can read it without that image coming to mind. It's such a powerful word picture that Luke paints for us, isn't it?
And just a little thing to note about those words. He gave it back to the attendant and sat down. Now, I think most of us, when we read that, we think, oh, he's gone back, as it were, to be part of the congregation. But it's not. The language of sitting down is he's read from it. And again, we know as customary, we find this in Acts with Paul. There's a visiting speaker. Yeah. The people in the synagogue say, come and give us a word. And of course, in that context, you would sit down to teach, which of course is why we have things called cathedrals.
Yes, indeed.
The cathedra is the seat, the teaching seat of the bishop. So actually, when he sits down, the reason why the eyes are fixed on him is because he's there sitting at the front, and they're waiting for him to bring whatever this word is.
Yeah.
So it's exciting stuff.
It is.
Right, where do we go from there? Then he goes into what he's read the content. Now, you mentioned the fact that the reading is a bit truncated. It's a bit more sophisticated than that as well, isn't it? Because he actually combines Jesus's or the text that Luke records is a combination, I think, of two texts, isn't it? So it's from.
That's right, and I think that was typical of the time. I mean, it was not unusual for readers to jump around within a close proximity of the passage. I mean, because obviously, if you've got a scroll, you can't easily unravel right back to Isaiah chapter 1 or something. You can go forward or back a few chapters. That was apparently quite normal. That was acceptable, and so he does something that would have been familiar in selecting from the prophets. You weren't allowed to do it with the Torah. You had to read that straight. But in the prophetic literature, you could actually do this. And to draw out a particular emphasis. And I think that's really fascinating that that's what Jesus appears to be doing here.
And of course, the link between the two is this idea of release, proclaiming liberty to the captives, recovery of sight and liberty, release to those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor.
Yes.
Did you pick up, particular themes from that language of release?
Yes, I think the whole passage itself is, has got this interesting structure where you have something about proclamation and preaching, and then there's a parallel with justice and those sorts of things, and then right in the middle you have this recovery of sight to the blind, something about compassion, really. Yeah. And I think the way in which those are woven together in a poetic structure really emphasizes that they must go together. That you cannot have the fullness of God's life without each one of those. Yeah. We are called to, I suppose, intellectual assent. Really, we're called to believe the good news that God is in Christ, reconciling the work to Himself. We're called to advocate for justice because God is a God of justice, and we're called to live out the compassion of God in the world. And you need all three of those things.
And that was particularly striking, the emphasis on the preaching as well, because actually Luke here changes Luke or Jesus slightly changed the wording from the Greek version of the Old Testament.
Yes, absolutely.
So precisely to actually include that language of kerusso, of preaching, proclamation.
Which we're familiar with, of course. Yeah.
Which also ties in with the fact that when he talks about Jesus being in the power of the Spirit, he does that particularly in relation to his teaching and his preaching. And again, that continues. That course continues into Acts. Yeah. I commented, I think, in the written blog post about there being three dimensions to this. So this whole language of release. I mean, you actually mentioned it right at the very beginning, that holding together the practical and the spiritual. And there's a sense in which this release language, Epiphany, has both those meanings, in the sense that it can just mean to set somebody free from bondage, but it also has a particular meaning of the release, the forgiveness of sins.
Yes, which appears to be. I think there's more emphasis on that here than there is on the first, actually, and
Okay.
I think several commentators make a good argument for that.
In this particular passage, you mean?
In this particular passage, it's not that the other meaning, as it were, is not present, but it does rather emphasise the release from sin, and then in a sense the other two things are about sin in different kinds of ways. I mean, justice and compassion are also about those things. But I think that's where he starts. He starts with the power of forgiveness, of release from sin. Yeah.
And that prophetic word has also, secondly, got quite strong links with the language of Jubilee from Leviticus.
Yes.
Proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. It seems to me that's Isaiah is picking up in the Haftarah, in the prophets. Isaiah is picking up that language from the Torah.
Yes.
Of the year of Jubilee, and that's been hugely significant. So we've got the Jubilee Centre in Cambridge, and the language of Jubilee for actual campaigns for the forgiveness of international debt. So there's a really interesting connection there. Just again, rereading this, one thing I was fascinated by is the discussion about exile. Now, again, I keep getting into discussions about this because a number of folk will be aware that Tom Wright, in his writings about the situation in the first century, makes a big deal of Jewish hope for the end of exile. So particularly in the New Testament, the people of God, he talks about, what's their expectation of the coming one, of Messiah, and will he bring exile to an end? And Tom's theory is that when you look at the range of expectations in first century Israel, one way of understanding that is that they don't think exile has really come to an end. Now, he's actually received quite a lot of criticism for that. So some other scholars point out, well, yeah, that would be absolutely fine if it weren't for the fact that we don't actually find that kind of language anywhere in this particular period. But I was just again struck by the fact that there are connections in some of the intertestamental literature where a number of Jewish sources do believe that what will happen when Messiah comes will, perhaps not the end of exile, but the final full return to the land and freedom, because of course, although they are physically in the land, they're not free from Roman occupation anymore, which is part of the deal. But the connections that there were in the expectations for the full freedom of the people on the one hand, as being a fulfillment of the Jubilee promise on the other. I don't know if that struck you as significant.
Yeah, and I suppose the other thing about this whole exile question here, of course, is we're in Galilee, so we're in a border country. I mean, it's not, yes, of course, the Jews were in the land, but they weren't in control. But in Galilee, it's even more ambiguous. There's a lot of Gentiles around, and I think that whole thing about, if it's true that Nazareth was quite conservative, then that kind of becomes, even more of an emphasis here. So. It's got some interesting dimensions to that question, I think.
Now, there's one more serious question we haven't tackled yet. I mean, you mentioned right from the very beginning the fact that the lectionary cuts the bit off, but also that Jesus doesn't read everything from that passage in Isaiah. And you mentioned the overturning of the Gentiles and the Gentiles serving Israel. But of course, there's also one very striking omission, which is, just right amongst those verses from Isaiah 61, and the day of vengeance of our God.
Yeah.
Now, there's all sorts of theories about why that is. And so some people say, well, on the one hand, this distinguishes Jesus from John, because as we saw a couple of weeks ago, John very clearly talks about judgment. And he talks about the fact that Jesus, the one who is to follow him, comes with his winnowing fork in his hand and will bring the Spirit, baptism of the Spirit and fire. And that raises an interesting question about, was John right about Jesus? And the second question is, does Jesus himself bring judgment? And again, some people would read this and say, but John and the Old Testament, fiery judgment, all that kind of stuff. Jesus comes with grace, and it's all much nicer. So, do you think those wash?
Well, I'm not convinced, actually. I mean, I think that the reason Jesus doesn't include the day of vengeance of our God, is because I think in Isaiah it's really directed against Gentiles. So you've got that if you're a Jew, you want God to wreak vengeance on the Gentiles, and of course what Jesus is doing here is he's rather turning the pointing finger towards the Jews. So he's saying, he doesn't want to emphasize that. He wants to, through the stories of Elijah and Elisha, and through what he omits in the Isaiah 61 passage, he's actually saying you need to beware because judgment's coming on you if you don't believe. And I think that's part of something that actually is played out. So the problem with just saying, oh well, it means that it's gentle Jesus, meek and mild, there's no judgment. Actually, there's always judgment on us, and we need to hear that. We need to hear that, because the only escape is to believe in Jesus and actually live out the gospel. And I think that's what's going on here in Nazareth. That the Jews want a message that God is going to slosh the Gentiles essentially, but actually God in Christ is saying to them, you haven't quite been living out being a light to the Gentiles, picking up that from the Nunc Dimittis in the way that you should have been, and so you need to work out that's what you need to be doing.
And one of the observations I make is you do get that language of vengeance coming rather awkwardly for us in Luke 21, where when Jesus approaches Jerusalem for the final time, he says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, you'll know that its desolation is near. Keyword desolation. For this is the time of vengeance in fulfillment of all that has been written. And I can't read that without thinking that this is the next verse of Isaiah that he didn't read in
yes, and I mean Luke is so well structured, isn't he? That you feel as though that's perfectly finishing off the sentence that begins here in Luke chapter 4. Yeah,
indeed.
Yeah, I agree.
Now we need to wrap up, and I'm going to ask you the same question I asked last time, but maybe particularly in relation to that point. So, other key things that you've taken away from this passage personally, and you take into preaching. I suppose I want to challenge you and say, that language about judgment. How do we preach that? Is that possible to incorporate that within preaching on a Sunday?
Gosh, I mean, I have a colleague actually who's really good at this, and seems to have the gift of.
He's really good at talking about judgment. All right, okay.
Yeah. So, and interesting, I'm not preaching on Sunday, so it's not down to me to do it. But I think you can, but you can only preach judgment if you preach grace at the same time, and those have to go together, don't they? Because the great thing about the message that Jesus brings is that there is judgment, but there's also escape from judgment, and that's through the grace that comes from the cross and the forgiveness that Jesus brings. So I think you have to hold them together.
Yeah. Great.
But don't bottle the judgment.
Okay, don't bottle the judgment. That's the message to take away. Great. James, thank you very much for the conversation. I really enjoyed it again today. And thank you, viewers, for coming and joining us. We actually had quite a good and slightly surprising viewing last week. It was, I think, more than we expected. So if you've enjoyed it, do pass the word on. I think it should be appearing in your screen, probably somewhere here. I think a button so you can subscribe and you can watch videos in future weeks. And we look forward to seeing you again. So thank you very much, James. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.